everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Sounds good. Thank you so much for coming into this incredible event with Matt Broomfield as part of our Book Crunch series. So for those of you who don't know, kind of like our Book Crunch series, it's an independent book festival organised between Argonauts Madhouse and Taekwondo, so Alt Book Festival. I know, very catchy. It's all free events, so do check out the program. There's loads of stuff going on. And thank you so much for giving up this unseasonably warm day to actually check out this event. I'm just going to do the introduction, and then Matt will take it from there. So, Matt Broomfield is a journalist, poet, and organizer. From 2018 to 2020, he spent 3 years living and working in Rojava, northern East Syria, where he co-founded the Rojava Information Centre, the top independent English language news source connecting the Kurdish-led autonomous regions with the international press. His writing has appeared in The Independent, New Statesman, Vice, The Nation, and Jacobin, among others. Please put your hands together for Matt Broomfield.
Yeah, that's perfect, thank you. Hello everyone, yeah, thanks a lot for coming. I won't continue to talk about the weather, but I really appreciate you all being here, and thanks also to Lighthouse for putting this event on in general, for doing this alternative book fringe, which I think is a very important corrective or addition or alternative, because it's called the Alternative Book Fringe, to some of the other stuff that is happening here in Edinburgh. So we really appreciate that, and thank you all for coming. So what I'm going to do today is speak about this book. I'm going to speak, I suppose, for a few minutes about the political context, the direct political context where it comes from, for a few minutes about some of the ideas behind it and why I wanted to write this book and why I think it's important, and I'll then read for like 10 minutes maybe, just to give a flavour of the beginning of the book and I guess like the very key ideas in it, and then there'll be some time for questions and answers, and then we can all leave. To begin, so this book is called Hope Without Hope, Rojava and Revolutionary Commitment. Could I get a show of hands who here has heard of or knows what I mean by Rojava? Okay, so some no, which I think makes sense. So I'll begin by sort of explaining that context where this book came from, and then go on to some other themes. So this book is sort of based on my experiences and work as a journalist, like embedded really with the Kurdish revolutionary movement. So the Kurdish people, as you're probably aware, are a stateless people. They number some 40 million, and so they're one of the most numerous peoples without a state of their own. Their homeland, Kurdistan, was divided up, particularly following the imperial occupation of the Middle East. So Britain, France played a key role in that, and was divided up between the states which became modern day Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Syria. As you can imagine, it's not a very good neighbourhood to be in. And so the Kurdish people suffered a lot of violence as a result of that, amounting to genocide and defeat of that ethnic cleansing throughout the 20th century. The Kurdish political movement began life, like many other political movements in the 20th century, as a Marxist-Leninist movement, fighting for an independent socialist Kurdish state. However, they then ended up following a different trajectory, and one of the key themes that I sort of speak about in my book, called Hope Without Hope, is how sort of good things can come from negative things, how hope can come from despair, how opportunity can come from crisis, and I suppose the fact the Kurdish people were unable to achieve statehood for this movement became something they decided to draw strength from and to rethink. So it never happened. They fought this guerrilla war, particularly against Turkey, but they weren't able to create an independent Kurdistan. Following those defeats, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, in particular following the capture of their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, that movement and Öcalan started to rethink some of the ways they organised and some of their goals. So first and foremost, perhaps they came to the understanding that they believed that any state would be repressive of people living within its borders, that even if they created an independent Kurdistan, that state would itself become repressive in turn, and that's something, of course, based on their experiences of repression at the hands of formerly colonised nations in the Middle East. Along with that, they came to identify the state as inherently patriarchal and to believe that actually women's liberation had to precede or was sort of the fundamental aspect of any liberation movement, and that women had to be freed and society had to be reorganised with a particular role for women before it could truly be liberated. And so, yeah, they developed this new vision, what they call democratic confederalism, for creating not as an independent state, but a sort of bottom-up federation, what they would call a commune of communes, based on like local neighbourhood participation, women's autonomy, participation for minority groups. This vision, which sounds and to some degree is, I suppose, quite utopian, became reality unexpectedly on a mass scale in the course of the Syrian civil war. So previously they've been able to kind of do this in some refugee camps where they had control to sort of try and build it up in parallel to these repressive societies working clandestinely. But the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, 2011, 2012, and the Arab Spring brought the opportunity to implement these ideas in Syrian Kurdistan. The Assad regime at that time left those regions, and the Kurds were able to take control and begin implementing these ideas, and not just for a neighbourhood, but for millions and millions of people. That project, then kind of spread and expanded in the course of this war against ISIS that people probably remember, or may well remember, this sort of Kurdish warrior women fighting ISIS that was in all the CNN and Daily Mail and BBC a few years ago. They were able to kind of defend their communities from attacks, from what they would view as a sort of patriarchal state, the Islamic State, and then after that also fought two very bitter wars against Turkey, which is also sort of a key NATO ally and is hell-bent on destroying this project in Kurdish-led autonomy. As you can imagine, this process was very challenging, very difficult, brought a lot of compromises, one of which is the battlefield collaboration the Kurdish movement engaged in with the United States against ISIS, which was sort of, I suppose, a tactical necessity, obviously created pressures on some of these ideas, and also failed to protect them ultimately from these attacks from Turkey, which repeatedly threatened their revolution. And also a lot of, ideological kind of compromises. What does it actually mean to have these ideals of sort of grassroots, bottom-up democracy, neighbourhood self-determination? But when you're speaking about feeding millions of people in the middle of what was, sort of the world's worst war zone for, much of the past decade, and defending those people against warfare, defending those people against airstrikes, and what compromises do you have to make? How do you work, with sort of large communities, very conservative communities, often in that region, maybe very hostile, particularly to these ideas of sort of women's autonomy that were being advanced. What compromises do you make? And so, that was kind of what first drew me, I suppose, to wanting to understand more about what was happening there. I heard about this revolution, and my background is as a journalist, and so I really wanted to go down to understand a bit more what's happening, and particularly what are these kind of compromises? Is it real, what they claim is happening, and see how they were sort of building something on the ground that was, organisationally functional. But I think, and so then there was a lot of interesting political lessons that I was kind of able to learn, and I was very lucky to be able to travel through the region to meet a lot of people, supportive of the revolution, very critical of the revolution, somewhat involved, Kurds, Arabs, meet with, people from all walks of life, I suppose, and I was lucky to be able to do that. But as well as that sort of pull factor, there was also a push factor, right? Why did I leave the UK and go and live? So I lived there for 3 years, like other international volunteers do in different capacities. And there's definitely a push factor, which was, a sort of a sense of despair, I suppose, of hopelessness. I was sort of politically active here in the UK, as I'm sure many of you are, in different movements, and also in Europe. And I was just kind of, just tired of losing all the time, I don't know if that sounds familiar, but we'd have, I was involved in different movements, and you could maybe have small victories, maybe you could help some people some of the time, you could stop this person from getting deported, you could feed these people, maybe for some other people who are more involved in parliamentary politics in the UK, you had kind of moments where you felt like you were achieving and building something, and it was pushed back. And I think that sort of hopelessness, certainly, drove me to this region. And I suppose, while I was there, it was also, I think that's linked very much to these organisational questions and the vision that they have and their sort of willingness and ability to work over a long time to put it into practice. But that's also linked to sort of, the political culture of this movement. And one of, I sort of saw, this, in the middle of this, this sort of chaos, this dystopia, they had this utopian vision, and I think there were reasons why they were able to continue working towards that, continue building towards that. And in this book I speak, a lot about, I suppose, almost the existential, certainly the psychological understanding of hope, of revolution, of change that that this like Kurdish movement has, and try to think about what could that mean for us, like in our communities. And yeah, I sort of I speak about different aspects of that. You know, I speak about the culture of discipline they have and the things that they've kept from from their time as this strict Marxist-Leninist party, and the ways in which they organise themselves in ways which can be a bit scary to us, coming from the West, because they require very extreme commitment, from their followers, to require people to give up their whole lives to this struggle. There's a sort of strict culture of hierarchy, a strict culture of discipline, and I think there's lessons that we potentially learn from that. I also speak about the culture of comradeship, which is very linked to that, despite there being this very strong organisational structure, there's a real sense of openness, of trust, between people, because they have this shared vision to hope for, and that enables them to make sacrifices, on a day-to-day basis, and to trust in one another. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. And I speak about, also I suppose, the culture that they have in responding to crisis, and for them, sort of responding to genocide, responding to ethnic cleansing, and how they remember their dead, how they use their losses to justify aiming for a greater tomorrow. And I think, those lessons, as I argue in the closing chapters of the book, are relevant, certainly for us, at the time of the genocide in Gaza, and worsening global crisis, but also, particularly in the climate crisis. And I think the sort of extremity, of the situation there is increasingly something which confronts all of us, not in the same way, but I think demonstrates the necessity, for this kind of broader international solidarity, and to build up perhaps, a political culture which learns something from some of the, the approaches, of this movement. So that was why I decided to write this book. I suppose on one level, it was something very personal, and sort of, thinking for me, as a sort of cynical, university-educated white boy from England, how comes it that I was so sort of doubtful and despairing, whereas people who objectively are in a much worse circumstance are able to believe in something more, but also, I suppose, extending that, throughout sort of, some of the organisational challenges we all might face, the difficulty that we all face sometimes in getting up in the morning and doing whatever it is we do, and having, a sort of open conversation about that. And, it's not like, the Kurdish movement's doing everything right and we're doing everything wrong, in our movements, right? And I speak also in the book a lot about, the dangers of some of these things, and conversely about some of the lessons as well from other movements that we know of or observed or been involved in. And I suppose just to bring this Rojava revolution, which obviously some of you haven't heard of at all, some of you might be vaguely aware of, say this isn't just a sort of freak and an outlier, this is something very important. It's a sort of, to me, it's this kind of epochal revolution of our time, and deserves to be thought of, and sort of therefore treated seriously and critically in those terms and engaged with. So that was my really with this book. There are other very good books which give maybe a bit more of an overview of what's going on there, by Dilar Dariq, for example, Women's Movement, or The Contradictions of the Cooperative Economy in Rojava by Aziz Aslan. Very good, I suppose, sort of giving a deeper history than this very quick history I've given here. So I definitely recommend those. But this book was going to be a little bit more about that political culture. So I think, I'll read now. As I said, a sort of truncated, I don't know how you pronounce that actually, a shortened version of the opening couple of pages, which, to give a sense of some of these arguments from the book, and then I'll take some questions as well. On the eve of battle against Turkey, Kurdish fighters gather around a smartphone, tarnished AK-47s slung over skinny shoulders. These men aren't supposed to own phones, but they all have contraband Alcatals anyway, using them mostly to fill the long, dull interludes between combat by playing combat games. The clip they are watching is popular here in Rojava, or Syrian Kurdistan. In the scene from the blood-spattered blockbuster 300, we witness the run-up to the Spartan resistance against the Persian invasion at Thermopylae. Spartan warriors beat swords on shields, preparing for certain death. The Kurdish militants likewise stamp their feet on the earth behind the berm and chant, wordlessly, in unison. Within a week, I think to myself, some of these men will be dead. In the film, as in the legend, the Spartans are all also subsequently slaughtered, but no matter. There's a perverse optimism to the way in which dubbed Hollywood clips circulate through Syrian Kurdish WhatsApp groups, wrenched out of context and deployed in support of whatever political, military, or perhaps more often romantic ideal the viewer has in mind. It's little wonder the region's Kurdish-led revolutionary forces feel an affinity with the embattled Spartans. In the face of crises set to define the coming century, their movement has produced an unexpected and utopian response, striving to implement a unique form of direct democratic, women-led, multi-ethnic governance. Yet, even after liberating millions of Syrians from the brutal, misogynist, theofascist rule of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIS, they must perpetually battle repeated Turkish military operations aimed at extinguishing these fragile victories. Turkey has the American warplanes, German tanks, the second largest army in NATO, proxy militias packed with former ISIS fighters. The Kurdish revolutionaries have nothing save their rusty AK-47s and a handful of bleak myths, into which they read calls for hope. These militants follow the intellectual and philosophical lead of jailed Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan and his Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK. In theory and practice, an extremist and in their unexpected revolutionary triumph, the broader cluster of parties, armed groups and civil society organisations inspired by Öcalan's PKK and collectively known as the Kurdish Freedom Movement has proven itself capable of finding, maintaining and organising hope throughout political crisis and social catastrophe. It was in response to historic defeats suffered by the PKK during the broader post-1989 collapse of state socialism that Öcalan initially developed his bold political programme of grassroots democracy, women's autonomy and minority rights. Similarly, it was the catastrophe of the Syrian civil war that enabled his movement to put this programme into practice, following the outbreak of what is now known as the Rojava Revolution. In the course of this revolution, Kurdish militants have battled not only drone strikes and ethnic cleansing, but also the same challenges faced by many of us on the global left each day: pessimism, despair, suicide. Yet the existential nature of this struggle, the repeated losses and terrible sacrifices, enabled the Kurdish movement to unite 4 million Kurds, Arabs, and ethnic minority Christians and Yazidis. By answering defeat with a revolutionary faith and transformation, the Kurdish movement and its followers placed themselves in a particular tradition of anti-fascist and anti-colonial resistance, absurdist philosophy, and radical thought. This current of hope without hope flows unseen through the millennia to explode into the world as revolutionary fervour, bound up with madness, self-delusion and self-sacrifice, as dogged resistance in the face of colonial violence and omnipotent state-backed neoliberal hegemony, as the mystic and utopian socialist horizon that has long justified the most gruelling and mundane political organisation. Though it sometimes seems otherwise, this strange backward hope hasn't been extinguished by the dead weight of late capitalist hegemony. During 3 years living and working in Rojava, I found this spirit alive and well, surviving thousands of years after the noble defeat at Thermopylae. And we may also this current down to our own diverse struggles, communities and movements, equipping us to shoulder our own revolutionary tasks in a similar spirit of grim defiance. The Syrian civil war, it's becoming increasingly clear, is this century's equivalent of the Spanish Civil War. It has prefigured an emergent and still poorly understood global conflict, just as that struggle between ascendant fascist forces and a doomed yet courageous socialist opposition prefigured the slaughter of World War II. The coming international confrontation, which Öcalan has long described as World War III, is set to be defined by factors that already marked the Syrian conflict, namely proxy warfare, resource competition, state collapse, mass displacement, political shockwaves emanating from the Middle East to shake the centres of imperial power, the potential disintegration of the liberal US-led Leviathan known as the rules-based international order, Islamist, right nationalist, or even Christo-fascist militancy as the main vector of resistance to the authoritarian state, the simultaneous statist exploitation of these reactionary forces, and all of it precipitated by rising temperatures, desertification, failed harvests, and the weaponisation of water resources. This global crisis certainly demands an effective internationalist left, capable of organising global resistance and exploiting the opportunities brought about by coming socio-political crises. But no internationalist movement has yet emerged to respond to our era of pandemic, climate catastrophe, and resurgent state conflict. As recent theorists have variously argued, the Arab Spring, subsequent pan-continental protest movements, and the brief flourishing of social democratic left populism were all undone by organisational and strategic shortcomings. In what's been called a decade of missing revolutions, a repoliticised spirit of often reckless resistance and desire for revolutionary change has not been organised into significant material victories. Millions have squandered their own hopeless hope at the ballot box, particularly in the Anglosphere and Western Europe, on barricades, particularly in South America and the Middle East, South America and East Asia, or under a hail of bullets, particularly in the Middle East. As Israel's genocidal 2023 war in Gaza has painfully sown, the world waits in vain for resurgent, militant internationalism, genuinely capable of resisting authoritarian violence in the Middle East and worldwide. Individual movements, uprisings and communities may have achieved fleeting or local victories, but there's no point in downplaying this general failure of the international left, and each failure reminds us of the bitter irony that utopia is, etymologically, a non-place. No wonder so many of us feel so defeated, and yet we continue to struggle for a better world, even a world we cannot believe in. How do we manage it? How is it that we may strive longer, harder and more boldly than liberal progressives, who claim to hold more optimistic outlooks for the future? How is it that the hopeless still hope? If the Kurdish movement offers a superlative example of revolutionary commitment in hopeless circumstances, the same spirit also animates 1,000 smaller land struggles, picket lines, rent strikes and indigenous insurgencies worldwide. Each day, admittedly weak and localised forces still somehow find the courage to withstand hegemonic capitalist powers they stand virtually no chance of overthrowing. And this absurd political commitment is not the preserve of an elite activist or vanguard class, nor is it a philosophical nicety divorced from everyday life. Rather, it forms a daily reality throughout our society, including in Rojava. Ordinary people frequently display an impressively radical political commitment, even to the extent that this might resemble self-delusion to sceptical, Western, or positivist eyes. A bloody-minded refusal to surrender is often most acute precisely where the Rojava Revolution has suffered the worst setbacks, forcing people to choose a radical commitment to its principles anew. In 2018, for example, the Syrian Kurdish region of Afrin was seized by Turkey, which forcibly displaced most Kurdish locals. Yet many of the 200,000 displaced Kurds chose to remain in an isolated exclave adjoining their occupied homeland, living in barren refugee camps rather than withdrawing to safer cities elsewhere. When I asked one elderly camp resident if she wasn't worried by living in range of the shells Turkish-backed militias regularly lobbed towards her refugee camp, she looked at me askance. "My tent isn't close to the front line," she said. "It's close to Afrin, my home." She wanted to at least smell the wind coming from our homeland's lost olive groves, she said, in a cliché phrase often repeated by other refugees. And in turn, her defiant presence, pointless in the sense there remains no realistic hope of her return to Afrin, was nonetheless able to create a real political impact, enabling the Kurdish movement to retain both a strategic military foothold and an ideological horizon to struggle toward. This tension is inherent in the very materiality of Afrin's refugee camps, where canvas is slowly being surrounded by concrete supporting walls, potted plants, and ragged vegetable patches. Each home embodies this conflicted yet symbiotic relationship between hard years in the wilderness and the enduring hope of return. For as long as these camps remain, a potent and unfulfilled hope will continue to spring up, its unreachable source just over the front line. And this doesn't imply any superhuman proclivity for resistance on behalf of the Kurds alone, idealising a diverse people, too often treated as a monolithic political bloc. Much the same mentality was present among civilian Arab families I met in the aftermath of the war against ISIS, who returned to their bombed-out homes to hang up washing on lines strung between ruined walls, still dirtied with ash and blood, willing community out of almost nothing. As in the Palestinian refugee camps throughout the West Bank, and similar sites of tenacious resistance throughout the Middle East and worldwide, these displaced Syrians prefer to remain in limbo. The Palestinians clutch rusted keys handed down through generations, as a mute symbol of their implausible belief that they will one day open their own front doors again, front doors they may never even have seen. Neither vanquished, nor with hope of victory, they remain, like the rebel in Albert Camus' philosophy, suspended in the active and productive tension of continued struggle. "Resistance is life," runs a famous Kurdish slogan, but for many ordinary Kurds and others throughout the world, it's more accurate to say that life is resistance. Thank you. I said thank you very aggressively to make sure you would applaud. So yeah, I hope that gave some flavour, some of the ideas in the book, and if people have any questions or indeed comments, then please raise your hand and shout out.
Thank you very much. It's good to hear a bit of hope. It's good to, especially given the sort of dystopian situation we're in at the moment in Palestine, and there's a march tomorrow in Glasgow. I came back from the march to the upper north where we got attacked. We got attacked in Australia, and people, just thousands of us, and we just went,
Yeah,
So
yeah,
much,
yeah.
so much is what I like to talk about is democratic federalism as an alternative to democratic centralism. Just that tension
Yeah.
between the Kurds and the Palestinians and not an unwritten solidarity.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, this, yeah. So, yeah, this question, just to repeat, was, about the relations between the Kurdish movement and the Palestinian movement, or the Kurdish people and the Palestinian people, and the fact that there are tensions between parts, at least, of those movements, which is something that's terribly important. So, thank you for asking about that. And I mean, it's going to be there is a sort of tragedy to the way that the state system in the Middle East operates to separate people who historically and perhaps naturally should be political allies. There are kind of ways in which that's being resisted and fought against. But just to I'll give some kind of background. So this movement I've been talking about began its life sort of in alliance with the leftist so the PFLP and the DFLP were training in the Bekaa Valley, and in fact, as they will surely tell you if you ask them about this, the first martyrs that died on the Kurdish side died fighting Israel at that time, and so there is this kind of long-standing historic obviously solidarity and this kind of movement as sort of an anti-imperialist movement fundamentally. So, and those principles I think remain and on behalf of certainly the Abdullah Öcalan, and in terms of the PKK, that's a sort of stance that they retain, and that sort of sense is certainly present also particularly among politically active Kurdish people. But as you say, latterly those relations are fragmented. Sort of certainly there's not really direct exchange and support between the two movements now. And then there's also kind of sort of deeper geopolitical issues that have kind of arisen, which I think is concerning. For many Kurdish people, also for example for myself, as someone who's critically in solidarity with this movement, and it's something we've been trying to raise a lot when we speak with them and when we meet with them. So I mean, sort of the fundamental issue is essentially a tactical one, I guess, in that Israel and Turkey are in this big opposition. And each side kind of tries to weaponize, Israel weaponizes the suffering of the Kurds and Turkey weaponizes the suffering of the Palestinians. So, Erdogan has come out quite strongly against the genocide, which, of course is in itself, a good thing. There is, sort of under the surface, Turkey and Israel do have this long-term sort of relationship of jostling, but then finding ways to get back on side. But, there is something genuine in that. There is also certainly a desire for him to distract from the suffering of the Kurds, and then Israel will sort of very vocally and very publicly say, we stand with our Kurdish brothers and blah blah blah, which is part of a long-term strategy for Israel that they call the periphery doctrine of instrumentalizing minority causes in the Middle East, not just the Kurds but also the Christians, or even Israel and Azerbaijan, for example, as a non-Arab country, and sort of trying to weaponize those minority causes in the Middle East. And then within the sort of Kurdish movement, it sort of plays out differently. So on the one hand, there's the Iraqi Kurdistan, which is not to do with what I've been speaking about now, and they're sort of Kurdish nationalists opposed to this vision. Historically, the enemies of this kind of movement, and they sort of have they don't brag about it because they're in Iraq, but they have sort of long-term interests, and they sell oil through Turkey to Israel, and that's been going on for a long time, and for them that's not really an issue. As I said, for PKK, they've sort of remained in this historically very opposed to Israel, and then with this movement that's now developed in Syria, I think they're under more pressure from their American partners, obviously, to I suppose respond to those Israeli overtures. I think it's not a question of Israel's not going to directly intervene on their behalf, kind of any more than America has actually directly sort of intervened to protect them. I think, but it is more a sort of a question of they feel like they need to respond to Israel saying this stuff to keep the Americans happy and create pressure in Washington. But I think that for me personally, that's kind of short-sighted and doesn't. I don't think it reflects their principles. I don't think they're actually going to get into any kind of relationship with them. But now in Syria, it's also related to the fall of Assad, and that now southern Syria is under sort of Israeli influence and Israeli pressure and Israeli occupation, and northern Syria is under Turkish influence and Turkish pressure and Turkish occupation. So in this kind of confrontation, it's sort of they sort of what they would say if you ask them is, you know, we are on the third side and we don't take any part in this conflict, and you know, we're just sort of we'll talk to any side. And there's a truth to that, but obviously it's very hard in the contemporary Middle East to maintain those kind of things. And then we'll also see what happens as the war with or as the confrontation with Iran develops, because Iran has sort of, there's only 2 million Kurds in Rojava, but there's 20 million Kurds living in Iran who of course have suffered tremendously. So an Iranian conflict obviously could bring opportunities for potentially something somewhat similar to happen there, maybe, or for a more political opening for the Kurds there. But also obviously then you're aligning yourself with those people who are conducting the imperialist war in Iran. So I mean, basically the problem with the Middle East, right, is if my enemy's enemy was my friend, then the Kurds will be the most popular people there, but unfortunately they're not. And it's I think a kind of tragedy that as they're sort of occupied by countries on all sides of the confrontation, they're sort of thus struggle to find sort of true kind of partners, friends and support on either side. But it's very important, and I sort of I hope, and there are in the UK also there are possibilities for the two communities to work together. Like now with the criminalisation of Palestine action, for example, there's some communication between Palestinian movements and Kurdish movements about that kind of shared experience of repression, and actually even though these two states that are repressing us hate each other, we don't have to be in opposition, right? But it's very and tragic, I think. I'm sorry, that was long, but it's an important question, so I wanted to do it justice. But if there are other questions.
So, can you talk a bit about Rojava's relationship with the other parts of Kurdistan, and are these ideas and structures and values being received well in the other parts you mentioned, Iran? Are you seeing that influence take hold greater?
I mean, I think it takes different formats in these, as I said, these different parts of Kurdistan. So Syrian Kurdistan, Turkish Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan, and one of the strengths of the Kurdish movement that I speak about in the book is this sort of diversity, I suppose, of tactics and a willingness to, sort of they have obviously these militant forces fighting an armed struggle, but also parliamentary parties, but also trying to build up civil society organisations, also meet humanitarian needs, and that sort of Catholicism of strategies and tactics, I think, is what has kind of enabled them to the extent they have to spread, sort of, I guess, spread these ideas in different ways. So I mean, in Turkey they have at times been able to build this movement's strongest base of support historically is in Turkey, and they have a great deal of support there, and that's been the key focus of their struggle throughout the decades. And there was a time when they were able to build up quite strong civil society alternatives. And maybe if we're thinking about what you might say about our organising in the UK, it can be a bit easier. In Turkey, it is, they have a parliament. It's sort of a democracy, not really, but kind of. And it's a little bit more similar, I suppose, to some of the context that we might be organising in, albeit much more repressive, and there are thousands of political prisoners. But there is perhaps something to be learned there in the way they tried to build up, sort of alongside their sort of parliamentary efforts, and they have a political party in the Turkish parliament, which I think is the 9th, because the past 8 have all been banned and thrown in jail, but they keep changing the name and inventing new ones, and perhaps sooner or later they'll stop banning them, or that's the idea anyway. And then maybe some sort of openings developing in Turkey as well. And then in terms of Iran, obviously Iran's an extremely repressive society, internally, so particularly to sort of to the Kurds, it uses the threats to its integrity as a state. There were, people probably remember, the Xinjiang Azadi protests, women life freedom protests after a young Kurdish woman was killed for not wearing a hijab in the correct way by the police there. And that was sort of, Xinjiang Azadi, women life freedom, is a slogan that comes from this movement, and sort of, the movement is also active in society there, so probably the strongest opposition armed force, or the only armed force that would today be capable of fighting within Iran is affiliated with these guys. And I'm pointing over there, they're not there, but those guys. So there is some room there, but then Iran is a very repressive society, and as I said, there then comes the risks of this woman life freedom thing was also immediately taken up by Hillary Clinton. I don't know what, while divorcing it from this context, right, of what these guys were originally fighting for. So, I mean, it's always, it's very complicated. I don't want to speak too much about the geopolitics of it, or I probably have enough. But yeah, there's always, sort of as things go down somewhere, it goes up somewhere else, and that fragmentation, like between these different states, has brought a lot of challenges. But then it also creates room that things can evolve and take a different steps. Then also now Turkey has just this year reached this sort of ceasefire agreement with the PKK, with this Kurdish armed group, and that could lead to another recalibration. And again, it's like maybe, sort of Turkey is wanting to stop having to deal with the Kurdish issue so much because they're more concerned about Iran and about Israel, and they sort of want to be aligned with these guys somehow against those two opponents, or at least neutralise the threat. So it's, as you know, everything in the Middle East is really up in the air at the moment, and so I think it's important that they're able to continue pursuing this so-called third way, but it's extremely challenging, as you can imagine. Okay, I think we're out of time. So I will wrap it up there. Sorry, I maybe rambled too much, but thank you very much for coming. I'll be around as well now if you want to say hi or you have more questions. And obviously support the bookshop. Thanks again to Lighthouse for doing this. Please buy books, including but not limited to my book. And also continue reading, follow what's happening in Rojava, and I think engagement and critical solidarity with this project is super important, and I've learned a lot from it, and I hope that other people can too. So thank you very much.